Welcome back, and thank you for being with us again. Thank you for persevering through yesterday. I was really energized by yesterday. Before I continue, I'd like to thank the Planning Committee, made up of youth, AMCHP staff, Title V leaders, and organizational partners. Thank you all for your leadership in organizing this event. Well, it's day 2, and I don't know about you, but I'm still energized from yesterday, as I mentioned earlier. I have attended some very informative workshops and poster sessions. I've spoken with exhibitors who are doing innovative work, and I've had the opportunity to participate in a number of very honest and thought-provoking discussions about race, equity, and family experiences. And I am still charged up and challenged by Dr. Malawa's plenary yesterday. It was a fantastic historical perspective of how we got here, a look at where we still are, and strategies for how to operationalize change. I'm equally excited about today's session. As an organization, we have taken our role of connecting with and meaningfully engaging with populations that we serve seriously. Although we aren't perfect by any means, we have taken steps to better understand how we can be allies to those we serve. The first steps in that journey for us is to listen, acknowledge our shortcomings, build trust as we build relationship, and look for ways to meaningfully partner. One of the populations we've been focused on acutely is our youth. Over the past year, we have been outreaching to our youth, and they've been working with us very closely. In one of the sessions this morning, I heard a youth panel say that the charge was for us to avoid adultism, which we've been trying to do. And embedded in that adultism comment, or avoiding adultism comment, is that we're challenged to not be dismissive of youth, recognize their strength, and engage them as leaders. In that thinking, we have, as an organization, established a youth advisory group. We've engaged our youth in our planning committee for this conference, and we've established AMCHP committees and board opportunities for youth under the leadership of our past president, Kate Wilcox, and our current president, Dr. Shirley Payne. This next session around climate change and climate resiliency came as a result of the youth's leadership, as they challenged us to prioritize the issue, given the real concern about the planet they will inherit. The topic was quickly accepted by the committee because of its relevance to our theme, the power of connections, building equity for healthy generations. One, connection. This is an issue that impacts us all, and it will require us to work together to find actionable solutions. 2, the focus on equity. Dealing with this requires an understanding that climate change has disproportionate impact. And 3, the building of healthier generations literally includes the world which they will inherit. In this next session, as we explore climate change, we'll talk about the science and statistics around it. We'll explore climate justice, the disproportionate impact on communities of color and our MCH populations, and the concern that those who are least responsible for climate change suffer its gravest consequences. And we'll identify ways that we as public health leaders can utilize thoughtful messaging to build resilient communities. To take us through this conversation, we are joined by 2 public health leaders in this field. First up, I'd like to introduce Surili Sataria Patel. She's the director for the Center for Climate, Health, and Equity with the American Public Health Association. Surili drives strategic development to bridge the gap between public health programs and sound policies. As director of the Center for Climate, Health, and Equity, Surili works to inspire action and advance policy that addresses climate change at the nexus of health equity. Also, she also serves as deputy director for the Center for Public Health Policy, under which Surili leads the organization's most notable environmental health programs, including water safety and security, children's environmental health, tribal public and environmental health messaging, transportation and health, and healthy community design. She applies her role in both centers to champion diversity and advance health equity and environmental justice while promoting public health solutions. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Surili.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm introduction, Jonathan, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm so glad to see such important learning continue to take place in the face of our new reality of physical distancing. So to start off, I'd like to share a story that riffs off of a childhood parable that has stuck with me for quite some time. The story begins on the 5th day, specifically, of an intense heat wave, where suddenly clouds of smoke descend upon a city downstream. 3 people from 3 different neighborhoods of the city were elected to investigate how the inescapable heat and choking smoke were linked and what can be done. The first person came from a well-to-do community and had a chauffeur drive them in a car. They were both shielded from the extreme heat, but the smoke certainly obstructed their visibility through the car windshield. The second person came from a densely populated community where people rolled on bikes, scooters, and skateboards to get around. And so the second person hopped onto their bike and took off towards what looked like the source of smoke. The visibility was certainly a problem, but so was the smoke itself, which made it harder for the cyclists to get enough air to pedal, not to mention the extreme heat experienced. Now, the third person came from a community that relied heavily on public transportation. But since the source of the smoke appeared to be outside of city limits, there was no public transportation option. So this person set off on foot. The visibility, poor air quality, and extreme heat immediately affected the walkers' journey. And since they were on foot, it took much longer to get to where they are, thus lengthening their exposure time. So after a while, the 3 of them converged on the same path, and since the smoke limited their visibility, each didn't know how the other got there, but they all agreed that the heat and the smoke was too much for them to bear and for their communities to suffer. So something must be done. Together, they continued forward on this path before them and soon stumbled upon this large, unknown obstruction on the road. The obstacle was so large that they couldn't continue on the path together. So they decided to split up and come back together on the other side to share what they found. First went the car. They were able to weave through the obstruction and almost make it to the front, but were stopped by a big puddle. It appeared to be a large spout of water flooding the path before them. But because they were in a car, they simply drove right through and thought how nice that water might feel against their hot skin. And though they had diminished visibility, they were still protected by their car. And both the driver and passenger couldn't quite gauge the depth or the width of the puddle, but it didn't matter to them because, again, they were in a car. The cyclist followed slowly behind the car, but had to stop to seek refuge under a large pillar-like structure that offered shade. The cyclist thought about how nice his active community members might enjoy breaks from the heat and smoke and other elements from pillars like this if they were erected throughout the neighborhood. And then the walker set out on foot, decided to climb over the obstruction to get above the smoke, which was too much to bear at that point. Instead, the higher that person climbed, the hotter it got. Taking pause on the climb, the walker observed how hot it was as the altitude grew taller. So finally, when they reached the top, the walker found refuge from a breeze passing through and wondered if somehow that breeze could be bottled into an indoor center that others could enjoy as a community. By the time each of them made it past the obstruction, they had it in their minds. They made up their minds with their respective neighborhoods needed to seek reprieve from the heat and smoke. The first passenger proudly said the solution would be to open up spouts like the one they came across for recreation during these really, really hot days. But the other 2 asked, well, once the water turned on, how can you turn it off? Is it going to be managed and controlled? The passenger in the car didn't bother wondering about these consequences of excess water because in their neighborhood, everyone had access to a car, so they could just drive around it. And there was little consideration about what to do with the smoke. Then the cyclist said conclusively, the only solution is to plant tall, leafy trees where bicyclists can take breaks on their journey. The car passenger immediately objected and said, because the trees will take up valuable real estate that could be used for roads and parking lots, they don't want them in their neighborhood. But the person on foot, the walker, he also asked, how can their community get tree coverings? But nobody was really listening. Then finally, the walker hesitantly said, well, that breeze felt really nice at the top of the obstruction, and it felt like a nice gift to give to those who otherwise wouldn't have access to either natural or manufactured cooling. But the first two ignored the suggestion because they knew that their tax dollars would be going to an effort that they themselves wouldn't benefit from. So rather than taking a step back to identify and name the entirety of the obstruction, as well as learn from others on the same path to discovering solutions, each person focused on the problem and the solution directly before them that benefited themselves and their neighbors only. In the original parable, the teaching that has stayed with me the longest is that the failure to understand other truths will be our greatest limitation to realizing the whole truth. So I know there's a lot to unpack in this parable, but I hope we walk away with three things. One is that we need to look at the bigger picture, not the immediate problem and its potential solution. And that we need to learn from various perspectives and disciplines and age groups. And of course, the potential and obvious solution before us may have some unintended consequences. At the American Public Health Association and the Center for Climate Health and Equity, we lead public health efforts to inspire action on climate and health. We want to advance policy and galvanize the field to address climate change because we believe climate change is the biggest threat to our health. And we must find multi-pronged, intersectional, and transformational solutions. So let's take a step back. What is climate change? When the sunlight reaches the Earth's surface, it can be absorbed into the atmosphere or reflect back into space. Certain gases in the atmosphere prevent the heat from escaping. And these greenhouse gases have been increasing due to, well, us, human activity. And the more greenhouse gases we see in the atmosphere, we will see an increase in both average and extreme temperatures, which then lead to harm to human health, especially that of children and the unborn. I hate to say this, but it's true now more than ever that climate change poses unacceptably high and potentially catastrophic risk to human health, and even more so to children. Not for any other reason, because they're not just little adults. They have unique biological systems, developing systems, and so on. Extreme heat events are increasing in frequency and intensity, and children are less able than adults, for example, to regulate their body temperature, and so more vulnerable to changes in temperature in general. And compared to adults, extreme temperatures have led to more heat-related illness and death among children, especially infants, due to dehydration. Then there's poor air quality. Climate change extends the warm season and lengthens the pollen season. So this means there's more airborne pollutants and allergens. And with this comes known chronic illnesses that impacts children's respiratory health, including triggering allergies and asthma attack. And then comes the insects and rodents that carry viruses that respond quickly to changes in the temperature and moisture, which can increase both their growth and duration. And to this, children are especially at risk for vector-borne illness due to their increased outdoor activities and their developing immune systems. So diseases like Lyme disease, hantavirus, dengue fever, and Zika are among the few climate related vector-borne diseases that pose a heavy burden on children. And then we're also seeing extreme number of cases with severe storms. And these severe and extreme weather events can impact sanitation and sewer systems, something we don't think about when we think about climate and health. But because of these impacts, we're seeing increased risk of water-related illness and gastrointestinal illnesses in children especially. And then given the changes in the weather due to droughts and flooding, we're seeing crops being affected. Simply their nutrient value, the quality is being altered. And these could impact, this could then lead to malnutrition or poor nutrition in developing children, and also resulting in developmental delays and adverse health outcomes for infants and children. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention mental health. We're seeing mental health impacts of climate change in young children and adolescents today. In the immediate, we're seeing impacts like wildfires and floods and destructive storms, even extreme heat, cause immediate impacts in children's mental health and wellness, like PTSD or anxiety, depression and stress sometimes even. In older children, we're even seeing episodes of self-harm, which is a new phenomenon. And then we're seeing gradual impacts of climate change, which come from more long-term conditions associated with climate change, like chronic stress that can result from gradual impacts of rising temperatures, elevated sea level rise, and other types of change in precipitation patterns. And the infectious diseases, chronic diseases like allergies and asthma, and nutritional deficiencies and injuries can also contribute to stress. And when we're talking about stress, we're also talking about chronic stress. Then there are the indirect impacts, which we often overlook or don't think about because our focus is often on the immediate aftermath of a climate event. But the indirect impacts could be things that impact our sense of self, our identity to community, and building social cohesion. So after a climate event, or perhaps displacement from a climate event, we're seeing more people having a sense of diminished community, where they rely on one another for social cohesion. And community impacts sometimes include domestic abuse and child abuse and other types of violence. These challenges are exacerbated by health inequities that communities of color and low-income communities already face. So why can't we solve this problem with a visit to the doctor's office or a prescription? As you know, that's because only 20% of what it takes to attain good health occurs from healthcare or medical care. The other 80% of one's ability to achieve good health comes through other social and structural determinants like education and housing and access to safe, affordable, nutritious food. It also comes from our outdoor environment and a sense of community safety. Such inequities are created when barriers prevent individuals and communities from accessing these conditions, reaching their full potential. So it's not all gloom and doom. I do have a few proposed solutions that we can take now in partnership. The first is to promote policies focused on environmental justice and health equity that are designed to address climate change adaptation and mitigation for children, so that we enable an environment and culture in which climate healthy and equitable choices are easy and accessible. And we need to augment training for the maternal and child health workforce by augmenting our partnerships with underrepresented frontline tribes and communities that are the most climate sensitive. Let's influence practice by quantifying health impacts to support culture change that prioritizes human well-being. And let's lend our voices as health experts by partnering with community action agencies and serve as a voice of connection to local or county government. And of course, if you are able to, please vote. While there's a lot of policy decisions that take place at the federal level, there are even more immediate decisions taking place in our communities. Local officials are responsible for our environments, our schools, our parks, our criminal justice system, and so much more. So it's so important to lend our voice because our children can't. I do want to touch on something that I am so proud of, is the US call to action on climate health and equity. And that's because this policy agenda really focuses and centers equity in climate action. And I can't say enough about how climate change threatens everybody in the US, but it causes more immediate danger to some than others. And it exacerbates health inequities, disproportionately harming the more vulnerable among us, including children and pregnant people. In some communities, while they experience systematic neglect and environmental racism, they have the least responsibility for contributing to climate pollution, but often are the most affected. So some of these communities lack access to political, economic, social, environmental, capital resources that enable them to build resiliency. And the actions that we take now as a collective can determine the scale of impact on our health, not just for us, but our children and our grandchildren. So with that, there's 3 areas that I just want to call out in the call to action. The first section really focuses on climate actions for health, and that's to emphasize things like active transportation and ensure everyone has access to safe and affordable drinking water and sustainable water supply. And then there are some actions that come from health that promote good climate, which includes engaging the health sector in a call for climate action. And of course, we need money to do this. We absolutely need to allocate resources that enable the health sector to effectively protect the health of all in the face of climate change, starting with support for the local, state, tribal health departments, but also building resilient hospital infrastructure. So I encourage each of you to check out the full call to action and learn ways to get involved. But there's a cautionary component to all of our zeal. And since I'm a public health wonk, like many of you, I like to talk about our equity framework. Let's start with procedural equity. This encompasses the fairness in political process and participation in decision making. So if we think back to the parable, we're talking about the cooling center idea and how the pedestrian asked for cooling centers, but the others, just ignored him or her. And thought how their voice in participating in the decision-making process wasn't valid. Then there's distributive equity, which highlights that we need to consider both the allocation of benefits and also the allocation of burden to any decision policy we make. And that, going back to the parable, we're talking about the water spouts. So the water spouts would inevitably help everybody in the city cool from the heat. But the burden would be disproportionately felt by those who didn't have cars or an escape route or vehicle in the event that the water were to flood or inundate the roads. And then there's contextual equity that recognizes that the playing field will never be leveled, but that the people's ability to access resource and power is determined by their ability to engage in the process, whether political or decision-making, and so that they can speak for themselves to determine the best distributive outcome. The tree canopy is such a great example, where if the pedestrian were heard in the conversation about having more tree covering in their neighborhood, then perhaps they could speak for themselves to determine how this outcome would then impact positively their neighbors. So I'm going to close with this. A picture is open to interpretation. And as health and public health professionals that protect some of the most vulnerable, like children and pregnant people, I feel like it's our responsibility to accompany the picture by a narrative that includes the entire truth. And that climate change is deeply emotional and deeply human. And it's no longer enough for us to respond to inevitable storms and floods and heat events that after they occur, but that we must build communities to become resilient and have tools for self-determination. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share with you some thinking on how we can come together to address climate change.
Really, thank you so much for that framing. There's so much that you presented and a lot to unpack there. And I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards, the Q&A, where we can really dig into some of the points that you raised. You really did a nice job to set the stage there. And I'm anxious to have our second presenter come and talk about how we as public health professionals can take some of the content that you just provided and appropriately apply messages that can help to build those resilient communities. So thank you for setting that stage. The second presenter, who I'm pleased to introduce, is Dr. Ed Maybach, who is a distinguished university professor at George Mason University here in Virginia. And he also works with the Center for Climate Change Communication. In his role, Dr. Maybach is a communication scientist who is expert in the uses of strategic communication and social marketing to address climate change and related public health challenges. His research, funded by NSF, NASA, and private foundations, focuses on public understanding of climate change and clean energy, the psychology underlying public engagement, and cultivating TV weathercasters, health professionals, and climate scientists as effective climate educators. From 2011 to 2014, Ed co-chaired the Engagement and Communication Working Group for the third National Climate Assessment, and he currently advises a myriad of government agencies, museums, science societies, and civic organizations on their climate change public engagement initiatives. Previously, Ed served as an associate director of the National Cancer Institute, as worldwide director of social marketing at Porter Novelli, and as the chairman of the board of Kids Save International. Ed earned his PhD in communication science at Stanford University, his master's in public health at San Diego State University, and his BA in psychology at the University of California, San Diego. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Jonathan, both for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be with you all today. So I'm going to use my time with you to start at the 60,000 foot level. And by that, I mean I'm going to share with you the results of polling that my partner, Tony Leiserowitz at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and I have been doing. Because it really sort of will ground you in what the people in your community, what the people in our country think, feel, understand about climate change, and what they know, if at all, about the fact that it's relevant to our health. But then I want to bring it all the way down to the ground. So I don't want to leave you up at 60,000 feet. I want to bring you down to the ground. So I'm going to try to connect what we know about what's in the public's hearts and minds, and try to offer to you some simple, clear messaging that I think will help you connect for the people you work with the reality of the fact that climate change is a human health issue and that climate solutions are really important health solutions as well. Okay. Bingo. So I want to pick up where Cirilli left off, actually. This is, I believe I took this from APHA, I'm not entirely sure, but Cirilli in the policy action agenda on climate, health, and equity, you know, the very first sentence of our policy action agenda, the statement was climate change is a health emergency. Lots of organizations have signed on to that policy action agenda. I've really lost count. Last I saw was well over 150 organizations were putting their trusted voices behind this really important statement that this is a health emergency. We do not have time to wait because people are being seriously harmed. Oh, I'm sorry. I was seeing it just fine. Let's see. All right, you're going to have to walk me through. This is embarrassing. Okay, I brought it back up. There we go. All right, can you see my screen now? All right, I'm very sorry to all of you for that little technical error. At any rate, so I've talked through this. This is the fact that as I was saying, and as Cerulli was saying, more importantly, that climate change is a health emergency. We've got a lot of work to do. But in terms of what the public understands, until quite recently, I'm just going to say 5 years ago, most members of the American public understood and accepted that climate change was happening. However, they saw it as a distant threat, not a threat for in our present reality. In other words, it was distant in both time, so they would see it perhaps as a threat for the year 2100, distant in space. So while Bangladesh, 2 days ago, I know for a fact, Bangladesh was at least 25% underwater, a terrible climatic catastrophe happening there right now. And most members of the American public 5 years ago thought, well, this is a problem in Bangladesh, not so much in Boston or in any other American community. And most fundamentally, most members of the public, as recently as 5 years ago, saw this as a plants, penguins, and polar bears problem, not a people problem. So in all three of these ways, in time, in space, and in species, we had a certain psychological distance between us and the problem of climate change. I'm happy to say that over the past 5 years, there's been a dramatic change in public understanding. And the direction of that change is very much in aligning public understanding with the current realities of climate change. So this is data from our most recent survey conducted in April of this year. And really for the first time ever, I feel comfortable in saying that the average American almost understands climate change as a here, now, us problem, a problem that is happening to themselves, to members of their family, to members of their community. It is still true that we do tend to see it more as a future problem. So you'll see that on the right-hand side of the slide. More a plants, penguins, and polar bears problem, again, on the right-hand side of the slide. More a problem for the world's poor, which it absolutely is. The bars, the developing country bar and the world's poor bars in the middle. And as we move closer and closer to us, we see it as less and less of a problem. And if you look at the dark green bars at the bottom of the slide, those are the proportion of our survey respondents who tell us each of these groups will be harmed a great deal. So we still see that fewer than 2 out of 10 people believe that people in their community will be harmed a great deal from climate change. I wish that were the case, but I don't believe it actually is. The harms of climate change are already manifesting in virtually every community across America, some more than others, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Of course, there is no such thing. You're all public health professionals. You all know there's no such thing as the general public. Our research, we've identified 6 distinct ways of viewing climate change out there among the American people. We call them Global Warming 6 Americas. I'm not going to introduce you to them all, but I will simply say they form a continuum from the group on the left, which we call the alarmed, currently 26%, 1 out of 4 of us, to the group on the right, which we call the dismissive, currently 7% of the public. The audiences, the segments in the middle of the continuum, they tend to be more like their neighbors at the end of the continuum. So the doubtful gentleman we call Doubtful David, currently 11%. He's a bit like Dismissive Dan, just less so. And the Concerned, currently 28%. She is a bit like Alarmed Alice, but a bit less so. She's less concerned. Alice is quite alarmed, like I am, for example. The point I want to make with this slide, 2 points. One is that we're not all the same. There's obviously a real diversity of ways of seeing this threat out there in America. But secondly, 5 years ago, the alarm segment the doubtful segment and the dismissive segment were all approximately equal in size. They were all 12, 13, or 14% of America, fell into those three segments. 5 years later, i.e. today, you can see the alarm segment has more than doubled. The doubtful segment has contracted substantially, and the dismissive segment, quite surprisingly, has contracted even more. So a segment that was once 12, 13% 5 years ago is now down to 7%. Yet I would contend that when most of you think about climate change, you only think about the two groups on the end, the alarmed and the dismissive, and you probably think that America is more or less divided 50-50 between these two groups. It just isn't so. And I'm happy to say that the two groups are changing in size over time in a manner much more consistent with what climate scientists would like us to understand about our changing climate. So here's some tracking data from our polls. This shows the proportion of Americans who say that people are being harmed right now by global warming in the United States. So you roll back the clock 5 years or so, right in the middle of the slide, 2015, it was about a third of our countrymen and women were said, yes, we're being harmed right now. Now it's closer to half of our countrymen and women understand that Americans are being harmed right now. Part of that is that we have a developing sense of this is not just a plants, penguins, and polar bears problem, but it's a people problem as well. So we asked both in 2014 and again in this year, we asked people if they think each of the following conditions that are listed down this slide will become more or less common over the next 10 years as a result of global warming, or whether they will stay about the same. So if you look at the orange or the mustard, I guess, colored bars, you can see that 6 years ago, let's just say between a quarter and a third of Americans thought that these conditions, this entire range of conditions would become either more common or worse in the next 10 years as a result of global warming. And now you can clearly see that it's closer to half. In some cases, it's getting close to 6 out of 10 people say, no, these conditions are definitely going to be getting worse in my community as a result of climate change. So we see this really important difference of 10, 15, almost 20 percentage points, actually 20 percentage points in the case of heat stroke caused by extreme heat waves. And from a public opinion evolution point of view, these are huge changes in a very short period of time. So something helpful is happening, and it is also causing increased worry about global warming. So this is the question we ask people simply: how worried are you about global warming? They can tell us they're very worried, they're somewhat worried, they're only a little bit worried, or they're not at all worried. And so what you can see here is that over the past decade, essentially, there's been an increasing trend in the proportion of Americans who are worried. Right now, 2 out of 3 of us are worried, at least somewhat, and about a quarter of us are very worried. I actually think a more appropriate response is that 100% of us should be very worried, but that notwithstanding, we do clearly see an increasing trend of concern about climate change among Americans. Now, this is one of the most interesting pieces of data from our recent survey, and it's very consistent with what we've seen over our past surveys. We ask people, what kind of problem is global warming? Is it essentially yes, no, or do not know? Is it an environmental problem, a scientific problem, and a food and agricultural problem, a severe weather problem, economic, etc.? And I'm just going to flag 3 of those for you, because I think these 3 that I flagged with the blue horizontal bars are really the 3 important ones for us today. So 8 out of 10, more than 8 out of 10 of us say, yes, it's definitely an environmental problem. The polar bear is what they are thinking about when they say that. The polar bear is the iconic image in most people's minds, the iconic image of global warming. 6 out of 10 say, yes, it's a health issue, a health problem. But our research shows that most of those 6 out of 10 can't name a single way in which climate change is actually harming the health of Americans, nor can they name a single subgroup of Americans whose health is being harmed first and likely to be harmed worst. And then the bottom, the one I've indicated at the bottom, only 3 out of 10 of us say it's a social justice or a fairness problem, which is really interesting and really disturbing, actually, because really climate change is an equity issue in every sense of the term. The fact that the people who have contributed least to the problem are being hurt first and worst by the problem just creates a massive moral conundrum and a massive social justice problem. So we have a whole lot of work to do to address that in an equitable way. So you've all undoubtedly heard of the concept of framing, mental framing. How we talk about an issue in our communication is communicative framing. How people understand the issue, that's mental framing. They tend to be rather closely linked. So it's no surprise to should be no surprise to anybody that most Americans think of climate change mostly as a polar bear's problem, because they've seen this image or images like it over and over and over again. These were communication choices by climate communicators that have created a really distorted and unhelpfully distorted understanding of what climate change really means and whose problem it really is. Sure, it's the polar bear's problem, profoundly so, but it's a people problem too. So I would contend that this is really the better frame. This is the frame that we, public health voices, trusted public health voices, we need to work to create this frame, to shape our communication about climate change so that people understand that sure, polar bears are endangered, but so are our children. Our children are being threatened by climate change, as Cirilli has suggested. In fact, they're being threatened by climate change worse than adults in 2 different ways. Their developing bodies are more susceptible to a whole range of climate and health threats. And perhaps even more importantly, the future we're creating, the future climate we're creating for them to live in, is becoming more and more dangerous with each passing year. So our children are very much what I think should be the iconic image that we help people understand when they think of climate change. So how do we do that? I talk a lot about the fact that from where I sit, and I've been a public health communication specialist for 40 years almost, had a lot of time to study what works and what doesn't work. And my conclusion about what works is simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. This is the formula that every public health communication campaign in human history that I've ever encountered that has been successful has comported to this fairly straightforward formula. And campaigns, public health and other campaigns that don't comport to this formula, they tend not to be very effective. So if we want to change people's frames of climate change, the way they understand the issue, so that we think about our children and our neighbors' children and everybody's children as the iconic species, if you will, of what is really being harmed, we need to have simple, clear messages repeated often by our trusted voices, and we need to encourage the trusted voices of others. So let me break that down. It's actually 3 different recommendations, all jammed into 11 highly evidence-based words. The first component there is simple, clear messages. Well, climate change is a little complicated. I'd be the first to admit it. But as communicators, we are obligated to figure out how to make it simple. And the reason why we're obligated to make it simple is because the human mind doesn't deal well with complexity. And because the less we say, the more we will be heard. So really honing in on only a few simple, clear messages that will have the most value to the people we're communicating with, to the people we're sharing our knowledge with, that's what we have to do. And most importantly is the third point on this slide, and that is our goal isn't to share everything we know as experts. Our goal is to share the few things we know that will make the most difference to members of our target audience. And therefore, we actually have to do audience research or use other people's audience research to identify what will be most helpful for our audiences to learn about the risks that we're sharing with them. So why do we have to repeat things often? It is so boring to say things again and again, but we have to. I'm sorry, we just do. Aristotle was teaching his contemporaries this 2,500 years ago. Repetition is the mother of learning is the English translation of what he was teaching his students 2,500 years ago. Over the past 50 years, social scientists like myself have done a boatload of research proving that repetition is also the mother of liking and the mother of trust. You have to say it over and over and over again for people to learn it, to accept it, and to trust it. We don't have to say it the same way every time. We can elaborate, we can adapt to the circumstances, but we absolutely have to create opportunities to say it over and over. And we can use visual and verbal imagery. We can use metaphors, visual imagery to help reinforce our words. So it does invite us to be creative in the way we repeat ourselves so that we don't bore ourselves to death, but we absolutely must repeat ourselves often. And politicians know this better than anybody else. This pithy quote from Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster, you say it again and again and again and again and again, and about the time that you're absolutely sick of saying it is about the time that your target audience has heard it for the first time. This is so fundamentally true. And anybody who wins their candidacy for elected office manages to learn this and incorporate it into the way they campaign. And we as public health communicators, we as climate communicators have to learn the same, have to be willing to be disciplined to implement this fundamental reality of human communication. And then the final point, which is where there is no trust, there is no learning. People will not accept what we're trying to share with them if they don't trust us. And sometimes they won't trust us. And there's nothing we can do to earn their trust. So in those instances, we have to determine who is most trusted to our members of our target audience. And we have to encourage them to share our simple, clear messages with the target audience, even if we don't have the ability to do so directly. So this comes back to the value of simple, clear messages. The simpler and clearer our messages are, the easier it will be for other trusted messengers to learn them and incorporate them into their own thinking, incorporate them into their own manners of speech, and share them with the people that they are engaging with. And ideally, communication, real success in public communication, comes when members of our target audience start sharing our simple, clear messages with one another. Because when we share with the people in our families, our neighborhoods, our workplaces, those are the people, that has us sharing with the people who trust us, who we love the most and who trust us the most. Real trust comes from interpersonal relationships, not from distant officials. So simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. Now, let me break that down in terms of what I think the simple, clear messages are with regard to what we know about climate and health. And this is a busy slide. I apologize for that, but let me break it down for you. Up in the upper right-hand corner is simply an acknowledgement that climate change is complicated, right? I don't need to convince any of you of that. But our research, Tony's and mine and our colleagues' research, has shown that there are really only 5 facts about climate change that are particularly important for members of the public to understand. So if you come down the right-hand column, that the first fact is that global warming is real. It's happening. The second fact is that humans, what we are doing, burning of fossil fuels, denuding, cutting down tropical rainforests, these are the primary causes of climate change. So climate change is human caused. The third important fact is that, based on the evidence, based on the facts, virtually all of the world's climate scientists are convinced that human-caused climate change is a reality, and they're all really incredibly worried about it. The fourth fact that people need to understand is that the impacts are serious, and not just for polar bears, but the impacts are seriously affecting human beings, and they're going to get much worse unless we take the kinds of actions that are necessary to actually deal with the problem. And then the final, essentially, fact is, look, there are actions that we can take that will make a huge difference. We can prevent a whole lot of unnecessary warming, and perhaps even more importantly, we can prevent a whole lot of unnecessary human suffering as a result of the warming that has already happened and is likely to happen going forward. So we can take those 5 facts and boil them, essentially summarize them in these 10 words on the left-hand side of the slide. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, and there's hope. How complicated is that? Not very. That's really all we need to share in order to cultivate a much deeper, much more appropriate, much more science-based understanding of climate change among members of the American people. So now let me break it down one step further. I've actually taken that and sort of translated it into what I consider to be appropriate public health messaging. And I just decided 3 is enough. 3 is all we're going to do today, because 3 is enough. Your job isn't really necessarily to convince people that climate change is real and human caused and the experts agree. You're not most of you aren't climate scientists. There might be a few with us today, but most of you aren't. I am certainly not. I've been embedded in a climate science team for the past 13 years, and I would never represent myself as a climate scientist. But what I am is a public health professional. And what I'd like to share with you, and I'd like you to share with your members of your community, is that climate change is harming our health now, in communities across the nation, in your community, in my community. So really already walked you through the specific ways in which climate change is harming our health now. The second point that's incredibly important to make is the equity point, is the fact that any of our health can be harmed, but some of us face greater risks than others. Our children, regardless of their age, our children, our student athletes, pregnant women, profound risks faced by pregnant women. The elderly, I'll just leave it there. Those are your children, student athletes, and pregnant women. For our purposes today, we're just going to focus on them. But actually, let's go to the end of that sentence. People in low-income communities and certain communities of color, they are also more likely to be harmed by the health risks, by climate change. And that's just not okay. These are people who we need to we need to take actions to make sure that we will all be all right, but we especially need to take actions to make sure that members of those communities will be fine. And then the final point is in many ways the most important point. Some colleagues and I are just doing research right now on what are the components of the message, the climate and health message that move people to action best. It's this third point. It's the solutions point. People really respond well. Even super conservative people, even dismissive Dan, who I introduced you to earlier, even he responds very well to information about the health benefits of climate solutions, not because he believes in climate change, but he believes in health benefits from these actions. So the message essentially is there are a lot of things we can do right now to prevent health harms from climate change. We can clean up our energy supplies, which help us clean up our air and our water, which we all understand leads to better health for myself, for my child with asthma, for my father-in-law who has chronic obstructive lung disease. We can make our communities greener. We can literally plant the trees that Cirilli was talking about. We can green our roadways, and in a variety of other ways, we can make our communities greener, which makes them, by the way, more heat resistant, more cooler during heat waves. And that's really wonderful for us in a variety of ways. We can change the way we move people around our communities, relying much more on active transportation and mass transportation. We can change what we eat and where we grow it and how we get it onto our table. All of those things are actions that we can take that will have not only climate benefits in the distant future, they will have health benefits today. The sooner we do these things, the more health benefits we will enjoy. And I can honestly say, as a public health professional, I don't flinch at all when I ask that final question: what the heck are we waiting for? These actions are paid benefits, really profound health benefits immediately. And if we implement these actions with an eye towards creating fairer, more equitable communities, the people who need these benefits most will in fact have them at the same time, if not sooner, than people at large. So I came bearing gifts today. It's always nice to bring gifts to a party. So one of the gifts that I bring is this program that I've created with my partner organization called Climate Central. These are materials that we've developed for TV weathercasters around America to help them tell the story to their viewers about how climate change is already changing conditions in their backyard today. Well, a lot of these materials that we've created for TV weathercasters, as it turns out, they're enormously useful for public health professionals. So I've just flagged 3 of them. You can find our entire library of materials. If you Google search Climate Matters Media Library, it'll take you to the page in the upper left. But you can see, you know, regional versions of regional depictions of how high humidity days have increased in different parts of the country. You can see the bottom right, the days above 90 degrees when things start to get dangerous in some part of the country that I can't read right now. And my personal favorite, since I live in the Washington, D.C. media market, you can see that we now have more mosquito days as a result of hotter, more humid conditions in my community. So these are incredible materials that you can go and search our library, or you can leave us your email address and we will send the new materials as we produce them each and every week. So this is great stuff. If you take nothing from me, I encourage you to Google the words Climate Matters Media Library and sign up for these materials. The other present I brought is that my colleague Tony Leiserowitz at Yale, he takes our national survey data and he and his team of whiz-bang statisticians have figured out how to downscale the data all the way to the local level. So for like 30 different indicators of public understanding of climate change and public support for climate solutions, you can go all the way down to your metro area or your county, and you can see a profile of what people in your county think. I just happened to take this screen capture because I was on the site yesterday and I noticed that there's something really interesting going on in the counties adjacent to the Mississippi River between Memphis and Baton Rouge, essentially. This happens to be a representation of the proportion of people who say global warming is already harming people in the United States. And the national average is 48%, but you can see that along the southern Mississippi, people in those counties, they're clued into the fact, many more of them are clued into the fact that people already in the US are being harmed by climate change. I don't know exactly why they believe that, but I have a pretty good guess. It's got a lot to do with the flooding of the Mississippi River that has been happening with greater and greater frequency. Another thing that you will learn from these maps, these Yale climate opinion maps, is that far more Americans support climate solutions than the proportion who are even worried about climate change. So this happens to be a representation of the proportion who tell us that, yes, I support the policies that will provide tax rebates for energy efficient vehicles or solar panels to people, to individuals. You can see that, you know, again, in these same communities in the lower Mississippi, you just get overwhelming agreement. And in the entire South, at least the portion of the South represented on the slide, you know, even in the least supportive communities, it's at least 6 out of 10 people who support this kind of climate solution. So our maps have a whole bunch of different takes that will teach you a lot about what the people in your community think. But here's the bottom line as far as I'm concerned. We see this in every community in America. Americans see clean energy as our future, as our better future. They say they want to see somewhat more or much more solar and wind and geothermal, and almost nobody says they want to see more oil or coal, and very few people say they want to see more nuclear. So Americans overwhelmingly, across the political chasm, they think clean energy future is a better future. And the reason why, it comes back to us, my friends. The reason why is because people understand that clean energy is healthful energy, that coal is dangerous, is bad for our health, that nuclear is dangerous, threatening to our health. I can't believe we didn't include oil on this slide, but we didn't. But when in other surveys where we've included oil, it's right up there with coal. So people get the fact that oil and coal, fossil fuels, these are unhealthy fuels. They want to see America pivot towards clean energy. So I leave you with this, these 3 messages. Our research shows, in a variety of different studies that we've conducted, shows that when we explain these 3 things to members of the public, regardless of their age, regardless of their political persuasion, regardless of their race, ethnicity, they find value in this information. It helps them understand the problem in ways they hadn't previously, and it helps cultivate what we would call climate engagement. It helps strengthen their belief that we as a nation and we as a community should respond, and it makes them essentially more supportive of a whole raft of different climate solutions. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope that you agree with me that these simple, clear messages are really, they're not so complicated. They're pretty simple. These are messages that you can convey when and where you choose to. They are all evidence-based. They are all absolutely supported by the science. And you don't have to be an expert on climate science. You can just be an expert on maternal and child health.
Thank you so much, Ed. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. That was a fantastic presentation with a lot of information that was palatable and appropriate for the climate change, climate resiliency conversation. But if you could see the chat box, there's a lot of application across broader public health in terms of how to message issues and how to work with trust partners in getting our messages across. And the thinking around simple messages are most profound. Was really a note that was resonating in the chat box. I want to. This question came through, and it was one of the questions that I was also thinking about and looking at your slides preparing for the conversation today. So I'll lead off with this and get your thoughts on this. Maybe starting with you, Surili. How does environmental racism play a role in widening the health equity gaps associated with climate change?
That's a fantastic question. I think, well, let me just say it's kind of hard to talk about environmental racism without talking about environmental justice as well. And then because, again, we're public health, we like to look way upstream. And so it's hard to talk about these issues without even introducing race and racism as a public health issue. So I guess in essence, let's talk about racism. It offers an opportunity to, it offers opportunities, let's just say that, and it also assigns values based on the color of a person's skin. And at the risk of possibly oversimplifying, racism inevitably divides people into multiple categories. And I say that because every group experiences racism in a different way. And that it can be applied intentionally or unintentionally, and it's baked into our systems and our policies that offer either opportunities, advantages, or disadvantages to achieving good health. And environmental racism does just that. It disproportionately impacts environmental hazards on people of color without oftentimes their input. And so how does climate change impact, or how is climate change further exacerbated by environmental racism? Well, let's look at housing, for example, or energy. In those contexts, we're looking at race as a leading indicator for placement of toxic facilities, which compounded with high heat days or poor air quality further exacerbates the health of those populations, those people living near. And then if you look at housing in general, and we're looking at a very well documented social determinant of health, housing, the affordability, where your zip code is, the quality of your housing, the materials it's built with, all of those are linked to health. And then you get hit by a storm and there's standing water in your basement, and that causes molding, and you're breathing it in, especially for children. This is worsening our health conditions. And it's also important to acknowledge when we're talking about environmental racism that there are historical practices in our country around redlining and discriminatory mortgage practices that have further widened the gap of certain communities or certain people of color being able to live in certain neighborhoods. Without going too much into the facts and figures, there was a report put out by the Center for Responsible Lending a couple years ago, where it showed that African American and Latinx borrowers received drastically low number of conventional mortgage loans than white borrowers. So what does that mean? That means that they are often denied housing that would otherwise be something that would contribute positively to their health. So environmental racism, these structures, these policies that have been put in place are furthering achievement to the structural and social determinants of health that are outside of the medical field that contribute to our health. And that climate change continues to worsen because it's not just who gets hit by climate change. Everyone's going to feel an impact of climate change at one point in their life. What really separates certain communities from others is their resiliency, their ability, the affordability to bounce back. And that's where environmental racism really widens the gap.
Thank you so much for that, Cerelia. Ed, would you like a chance to respond to that? That was a question that came through the chat box as well for both of you, if you have something to add on to that.
No, I thoroughly nailed that one. So in the spirit of time, why don't we move to the next question?
Great. Well, thank you. So this did not come through the chat box, but I did want to talk about some of your strategies you outlined, Ed. So you gave us a lot of great content, great material, how to engage different stakeholders and trust brokers, trusted sources. Where should we be using these climate and health messages? Where would you recommend using those or to get our biggest bang for the buck?
Yeah. So I don't know how if you're all familiar with the concept of public health 3.0, but I love that idea. The fact that when we are involved, when we are running a public health program or we're staffing a public health program, we never have the resources we really need to get down to influence the social determinants of health that Cerelia was talking about. And so how are we really going to be, how are we really going to get to the root causes if in fact our resources don't allow us to get to the root causes? As I understand it, the concept of public health 3.0 is our greatest asset and our point of greatest leverage in terms of influencing root causes is our ability as public health professionals to explain to the other people in our community. Maybe that's other people in different branches of local government. Maybe it's explaining to our governors, health policy director, but other people are controlling resources that get much closer to the real social determinants of health. So if we, as I sort of intimated before, cleaning up our air and cleaning up our fuel supplies is the best way we can clean up our air and our water, and that is one of the most reliable ways that we can ensure that everybody has the opportunity to have the blessing of good health. In public health, we don't really have the ability to do that. We need to influence the people who are making the energy policy decisions. We might need to influence the people in our Public Utility Commission. We might need to influence our mayor or members of our city council, county council. And so I would say that in answer to the question, I want you all to be conveying those three simple, clear messages to everyone you can, but ideally keep in mind that you're trying to incrementally pass them from person to person to the real decision makers, the people who are making the decisions that influence the social determinants of health. And again, I would hold up public utility commissions as one of those super important set of decision makers who allow many utility companies to get away with the kind of egregious actions that Cerelia mentioned a moment ago, to get away with running, coal-fired power plants or petroleum distillation plants inside of the city limits where usually low-income communities are living and going to school and going to church, and that's not okay. We need to try to get our health view of climate change and the health importance of clean energy, make sure we get those messages to the people who really influence those policies.
Thank you so much for that. We have a ton of questions that are still in the chat box, and we won't get to all of them. So I'm just letting folks who've joined us virtually, obviously, know that our speakers we'll be able to respond to these questions. The link will be available, so the written responses will be live in a few days, but we'll have it available if your question does not get answered. In the interest of time, I do have one final question that I do want to bring to your attention from the chat box. So this is for Cirilli, but Ed, I'd love to get your thoughts on it as well. How important is a focus on community-based and local climate resilience efforts versus national policy measures?
Yes. Short answer, yes. They're both they're both equally important. I can't stress it enough. Oftentimes we think of climate change because it's such a big issue and there's so many moving parts and so many components that it's somebody else's problem to fix, right? Maybe it's the federal government, so they have the money, right? But it is partially. I think there's a lot of interesting entry points for the federal government to get involved in, including re-entering and fulfilling our part of the Paris Agreement, as an example. There's other federal policies, like Ed was mentioning, around energy that could be done. Agriculture is another huge sector that influences both climate change, but also the health of the workers. So at the national level, absolutely, but the local level is where change happens. I think Ed just alluded to this earlier, where a lot of the decisions that are made about our health, about our community, happen at the local level. So organizing is so important. I think one of my slides talked about voting, and I'll say it again because Ed told me to repeat myself. That's the only thing I took away from Ed's talk, where voting is so important, especially in the local elections. It's not just the national ones, because that's where all those decisions happen about our schools, about our parks and outdoor spaces, about our criminal justice system, which also has a connection to climate change, believe it or not. So all these things are happening at the local level. And what I can say, as public health professionals, oftentimes we say, well, you know what, that's not us. We're just focused on health. Let's just work with communities to build resiliency. Well, voting, getting involved in the political process is part of that. Health touches everything, believe it or not. And so if you can try to get involved in helping your neighbor, helping your community register to vote, if that's where the stop is, or how to get a mail-in ballot. This year is a little different. But also think about organizing. And because of COVID and this new physical distancing space we're in, and you can't, because of COVID or considerations of COVID to your health, please don't go out there to organize. But consider getting involved by donating resources, time, your expertise, your voice to the cause, because communities, believe it or not, know what they're talking about when it comes to how climate is impacting their health. They may not call it climate change. They may not call it building resiliency, but they know what's happening in their own backyard. They feel it, they live it. And so it would be so integral for us in a way to work in coalition with communities to lend that voice of health and tie in some of those messages that Ed talked about, but also the messages that you've been talking about through your career as maternal child health professionals. And so the efforts at the local level are equally important as at the national level. And sometimes it's easier at the national level because somebody else will take care of it, but it's really everybody's responsibility, no matter what hat you wear.
Thank you so much, Cirilli. Unfortunately, unless you're burning to respond, I may have to leave it right there so we get some time to acknowledge some award winners. We have a burning comment on that?
In 20 seconds. I've given a lot of thought to this. There are 3 things we need to do. We need to totally decarbonize the world's economy. We need to capture a lot of that heat trapping pollution that we've emitted over the past 200 years, and we got to get it back in the ground where it came from. And we need to make sure that every community on the planet is made more resilient to the health impacts of climate change. The first 2 are global. We have to do it globally. We can't decarbonize the world's economy in my community alone. But the third one is inherently local. So some parts of this, as Cirilli was saying, has to happen in our community. We have to become more resilient in order to protect the people in our community. But every community has to do its part in the global challenge to decarbonize its economy and to the extent that it can, to harvest heat trapping pollution that's been put out into the atmosphere and turn it back into solid form, nice, healthy soils, what have you.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you so much, Cerulli. I personally have enjoyed this conversation. Based on the discussion, it looks like others have as well. A lot of great content and some really thoughtful challenges. So thank you for your time and your thoughtfulness. You guys make a great 1-2 punch. I really appreciate that. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kate Wilcox, who is our past president for AMCHP, and she's also the Maternal and Child Health Manager and Title V Director in Oregon. Kate?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you both for such an informative and action-oriented presentation. Everybody should remember to vote. I'm going to have one more impression on that. Vote, vote, vote. Make sure that we've got it started. Yes, okay. So as past president of AMCHP, I've been coming to the AMCHP conferences for many years. And one of my favorite parts of the conference is the opportunity we get as a MCH family to celebrate and acknowledge each other's successes and contributions. It's just a little reminder that no matter how difficult things get or how thankless things may seem at times, that we as a community, we see you and we appreciate your work. Additionally, I've always appreciated how the work of the MCH community builds bridges and connections across the generations. It's part of the reason why in our mission statement, we don't simply mention women and children, but rather we focus on women, children, youth, families, and communities because we are all connected. So it's with these sentiments in mind that I have the privilege of announcing awards that both celebrate the successes of our colleagues and highlights and connects the work of our emerging professionals in maternal and child health with the seasoned veteran accomplishments of established leaders in our MCH community. So we will start with the 10 emerging maternal and child health professional award winners. This award acknowledges outstanding state or local MCH professionals under the age of 45 whose work has made substantial contributions to their state's MCH programs, their state's maternal and child health outcomes, or made other significant contributions to promoting and protecting the health of women, children, and families in their state. So from Region 1, Masa Yates, she's the director of the Massachusetts Center for Birth Defects Research and Prevention from the Bureau of Family Health and Nutrition from the Department of Public Health. After many years of working at the CDC and academic settings, Dr. Yates currently serves as the director of the Center for Birth Defects Research and Prevention at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. She is also an adjunct assistant professor at the Boston University School of Public Health, where she collaborates with faculty and provides mentorship to students. Her research spans several areas of maternal and child health, and she has over 40 publications in peer-reviewed journals. From Region 2, Jenny Blakeney, Adolescent Health Coordinator from the New Jersey Department of Health, Division of Family Health Services. Ms. Blakeney has an extensive background as a sexual health educator, advocate, and trainer. Her expertise is in adolescent sexual health, social and emotional learning, and positive youth development, including youth empowerment and engagement. She has worked in the field of adolescent sexual health and youth development for over 25 years and is key to elevating the youth voice within the maternal and child health community. Region 3, Emily Yates, Reproductive Health Unit Supervisor for the Virginia Department of Health. Ms. Yates works with her team to oversee the Title X family planning, adolescent health, resource mothers, and state funding for certain abortion programs, as well as the Contraceptive Access Initiative, which was launched in 2018. Prior to working at the Virginia Department of Health, she managed reproductive health programs at various organizations in Richmond, Virginia, including the Virginia League for Planned Parenthood, Minority Health Consortium, and the Virginia Commonwealth University. Region 4, Kimberly Seals, Maternal and Child Health Director, the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. With over 10 years of public health experience, Ms. Seals has seen firsthand the impact that prematurity has on infants, families, and communities. She is not only a champion for healthier moms and babies, she is an advocate for them. As a young public health leader, Ms. Seals enjoys reading and writing and speaking on and about how to better maternal and child health outcomes. She is from the great city of Mobile, Alabama, where Mardi Gras is her favorite holiday because it gives her the opportunity to be surrounded by her loved ones and friends. Region 5, Kate Shettle, Director of MCH Programs, Indiana State Department of Health. After years of working overseas as a public health professional, Ms. Shettle has returned to the U.S. and is committed to improving the infant, child, adolescent, and maternal health in Indiana. She is passionate about identifying gaps and improving the health of Hoosiers through evidence-based programming and evaluation. In her free time, she's an avid reader, enjoys working on home improvement projects, dreams of travel after COVID-19, and loves being an aunt. Region 6, Rosario Trujillo, Statewide Surveillance Manager for the Louisiana Department of Health, Office of Public Health, Bureau of Family Health. Ms. Trujillo has worked internationally in Central America, coordinating community-based health initiatives and stateside in secondary education, and helped establish the nonprofit, the Solidarity Project, to support additional initiatives in Honduras. Through her work, she aims to implement data-driven recommendations for the prevention of morbidity and mortality. She is passionate about combining data, policy, and community-level action to build state capacity to improve maternal and child health outcomes. Region 7, Kelsey Torres, MCH Behavioral Health Consultant, Kansas Department of Health and Environment. Ms. Torres serves as the project director for the HRSA screening and treatment for maternal depression and related behavioral disorders and the pediatric mental health care access programs. She has previously worked for the single state agency that oversees both mental health and substance use prevention and treatment services in Kansas, which supports this wide-scale operation, expansion, and integration of the system of care approach to improve behavioral health outcomes for children and their families. Region 8, Shivani Bhatia, Maternal Health Coordinator, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Ms. Bhatia leads Colorado's maternal mortality prevention program and is passionate about embedding health equity across Title V maternal and child health work. She has worked in maternal and infant health in Boston, New York City, and Mumbai, India. When she's not advocating for sexual and reproductive justice, health, and rights, she teaches trauma-sensitive Hatha yoga and volunteers as a full-spectrum doula. Region 9, Lisa Pressfield, Chief of Adolescent Health for the California Department of Public Health, the MCAH Division. Ms. Pressfield has spent the past 10 years leading and supporting efforts to improve adolescent health, both at the California Department of Public Health and at the Association for Maternal and Child Health Programs. She is a creative public health leader with experience ranging from high-level strategic planning and program development to on-the-ground program implementation and evaluation. She has worked both domestically in Washington, D.C. and California, and internationally in Ecuador and Bolivia, doing community health outreach and education, program development, program administration, and evaluation to support youth, families, and communities. Region 10, Margaret Young, MCH Epidemiology Unit Manager, State of Alaska, Division of Public Health, Section of Women's, Children's, and Family Health. As an MCH epidemiologist in the Alaska section for Women's, Children's, and Family Health, Ms. Young has collaborated with partners on the development of the Alaska Childhood Understanding Behavior Survey, also known as the CUBS survey, a follow-back to the PRAM survey, and has coordinated CUBS since 2006. She works closely with the data related to infant, child, and maternal health and mortality in Alaska, and in particular from PRAMS, the Alaska Maternal Child Death Review, and Vital Records. She enjoys hiking, camping, and biking in the beautiful Alaskan wilderness. Congratulations to all of our emerging MCH Professional Award winners, and I will clap for everyone on behalf. All right, now we're going to move on to the Excellence in State MCH Leadership Award. This award is given for an outstanding state MCH professional whose career has made significant contributions to the health of women, children, and families in his or her state. This award this year goes to Chris Hogg, Deputy Director of the Bureau of Family Health Services from the Alabama Department of Public Health. Chris Hogg has had a long and distinguished career with the Alabama Department of Health for over 30 years, and he recently retired in spring of this year. It does happen to the best of us. He worked in several different areas in the Bureau of Family Health Services and served as the Deputy Director for the Bureau since 2001, including serving as the Title V Director, utilizing his knowledge of state and federal legislative processes, and working closely with the state and local partners. One unique partnership has been with the Children's Rehabilitative Services, a division of the Alabama Department of Rehabilitative Services. CRS is the Children and Youth with Special Health Needs program for Alabama and receives block grant funds to fulfill that role. Chris made it a priority to maintain and grow the partnership between the two agencies, always looking for innovative ways that the agencies can work together. Congratulations, Chris. And now on to our Innovation Station Best Practice Awards. Each year in the fall and spring, AMCHP's Best Practices reviewers comprised of the Best Practices Committee members and other MCH professionals in the field, review and select practices for the inclusion of AMCHP's Innovation Station database, our online repository of what's working in the maternal and child health field. This year, we received 26 practice submissions. These practices demonstrated exceptional rigor and positive impact on maternal and child health populations, particularly in the area of health equity and stakeholder partnerships. So we have 3 awards. The first award is the Best Practices Award, which recognizes the highest scoring practice from 2019. This year, the award goes to One Key Question, a national practice. One Key Question is a transformative tool for health and social service providers that starts the conversation about if, when, and under what circumstances women want to get pregnant and have a child. The notion behind One Key Question is simple. It provides a framework for health providers, social service providers, and champions who support women age 18 to 50 to routinely ask, would you like to become pregnant in the next year? Though this is a seemingly simple question, the answers are more complex. One Key Question meets women where they are by offering 4 responses: yes, no, okay either way, or unsure. Follow-up counseling is patient-centered and can be tailored appropriately based on the woman's response. Our next award is new this year and recognizes a practice that demonstrates a strong commitment to advancing health equity. The Contributes to Achieving Health Equity Award goes to Pasos, Health Connections in Region 4. Pasos was founded in 2005 after research showed that Latino families needed more support and information from a trusted source to address disparities and health inequities, and that our state's support systems were not prepared to close those gaps. So Pasos became a bridge between Latino families and the resources they need, bringing families' voices forward to speak to the inequalities and inequities that challenge them, and deliver information to families in a culturally specific way. Our final Best Practice Award is also new this year and recognizes a practice that strengthens and highlights the power of partnerships. The Contributes to Stakeholder Engagement Partnership Award goes to Rhode Island's Health Equity Zone Initiative in Region 1. Rhode Island's Health Equity Zone Initiative is an innovative, community-led, place-based model that brings people in a defined geographic area together to create healthy places for people to live, learn, work, and play. Health equity zones start by building, expanding on, and maintaining a collaborative of diverse partners, conducting an assessment and developing a plan to address the factors that keep people in their neighborhood from achieving their full potential. The Rhode Island Department of Health provides flexible seed funding for 4-year cycles to support the development of an effective, community-led infrastructure that can drive transformation of policies and symptoms for healthier living over the long term. Let's give each of those 3 and Chris a big round of applause. Thank you to our Best Practices Award winners and to everyone who submitted practice to Innovation Station this past year. By sharing and replicating effective MCH practices such as these, we can work together to achieve our goals and improve maternal and health outcomes. And all of these short videos featuring the award winners can be seen on the Innovation Station webpage. So we encourage you to go and learn more about these innovative practices. And last, sort of the big award of them all, is our John Mcqueen Lecture Award, given for innovation in the field of maternal and child health. This year's Mcqueen Award goes to Dr. Nancy Byatt, Associate Professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts. Dr. Byatt is a perinatal psychiatrist and physician scientist focused on improving healthcare systems to promote maternal and mental health. She is an associate professor of psychology, OBGYN, and population and quantitative health sciences at UMass Medical School. She is the founding medical director of the Massachusetts Child Psychiatry Access Program for Moms, which has 1, increased access to mental health care for thousands of perinatal women, 2, become a national model for perinatal mental health care, and 3, impacted state and national policies and funding. She is the director of the Division of Women's Mental Health within the Department of Psychiatry at UMass Medical School. And she is the founding executive director of the Lifelines for Moms, a center focused on helping the healthcare of communities optimize maternal mental health. Dr. Byatt has a continued federal funding for research focused on developing and testing scalable interventions for addressing perinatal mental health and substance use disorders in medical settings. Congratulations, Dr. Byatt. And congratulations to all our award winners. You can read more about them on the awards page at our conference website. So as I close today's plenary, I just wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to serve as both your president and now your past president of AMCHP. It's been an honor to serve you both as a board member and in some of these leadership roles. During my time as president, we made a number of significant accomplishments that I will be forever proud of. And of course, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a whole team of the board and of the staff that contributed to this. We were able to roll out the new strategic plan for the organization, and I thank Jonathan for his leadership and the staff for all they did to turn the plan into an operationalized, livable document and livable guidepost for us as we move forward. We made significant strides in including youth and families in our work, as is evidenced by this conference, where youth were full participants in collaborating and planning this whole conference that Jonathan spoke about earlier. And we are moving forward with a couple of other ways that we're going to be elevating that youth voice and putting the A back into MCAH. And last, we really helped to lay the groundwork upon which AMCHP has built its health equity efforts. And I think one of the culminations was the We're All In statement that I hope everyone has had a chance to read. It really gives us a game plan of what the situation is and how we as an organization can move forward and make some real strides in improving equity for all in our country and for the maternal and child health populations. So while COVID brings much uncertainty, the future is bright, and we have a tremendous opportunity to truly bring about change and improve health outcomes for our populations. Thanks again for your support and placing your trust in me for the opportunity to serve as your president. I hope to see you in person, COVID dependent, in 2021, where we can continue these types of conversations. Lastly, I want to thank our sponsors who have supported to make this conference possible, the staff who have done a Herculean task of converting this in-person event to an online, and of course to each of you for joining us on this journey. We hope you're finding it interesting, stimulating, fun, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.